I'd start on something quite different. It's too big a subject to finish tonight, so it's going to be this meeting and next month to get all of it. I wanted to talk about the gospel in the stars. Now, you all know that from time so early we can't trace the beginning of it, that all the ancient peoples knew the signs of the zodiac. And with the one exception of China, they gave to the principal signs of the zodiac the same names. The Chinese called these various signs the pig, the hen, the dog, and so forth, according to the Chinese mentality. But all the others gave these signs of the zodiac the same names, with a few exceptions on some of the minor constellations. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about astrology because I don't believe there's anything to it whatsoever. But a curious thing, that from the earliest times, even these pagan peoples knew of the different constellations by these names, and as a matter of fact, what this sets out in the stars is the same thing that is set out in much more detail in our Bible, and it does not in any way grow out of or support their paganism. Genesis, of course, is not the earliest book in the Bible. While it talks about the earliest things, of course, Moses wrote that somewhere, say, between 1450 and 1446 BC. The book of Job, we know, is still earlier, because with all of the philosophic discussion in Job about why he had his troubles, there's no mention in it of the law. And certainly Job's friends would have pointed out this law and that he must have broken to have gotten into his trouble. But Moses, in the book of Genesis, records the earliest prophecy in point of time when it was originally given in the Bible. It's Genesis 3, verse 15. God has summoned Adam, Eve, and Satan before him to give an accounting of their misdeeds. And in Genesis 3, verse 15, he says to Satan, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. And the same Hebrew word, zerah, meaning seed, or figuratively descendants, is used in both cases. So Satan was to have just as literal children as was Eve. And God goes on to say, I will put enmity between thy seed and her seed. Thou shalt bruise his heel, and he shall, some translations say bruise thy head, some say crush thy head. So you have there the first prophecy of the coming Redeemer, who is going to crush the power of Satan, but suffer terribly himself in doing it. Now, from then on, you've got a long gap, because that was approximately 4000 BC, and from then down to the time when Moses wrote, or even Job, which goes back probably 600 years earlier than Moses, you've got a long gap without prophecy. Now, you do have some prophetic material in the book of Enoch, about which we can't be too certain whether what we have today is the original or not. It's true that one of the books of the New Testament does mention that Enoch prophesied about the coming of God to take vengeance. But the book of Enoch has remained on the apocryphal list because the churches have not been sure whether they could accept it at face value as inspired or not. Now, in that long gap in there, from 4000 to the middle 1400s BC, what was to keep alive the prophecies that God had given. Now we know, of course, that a much more complete statement was given to Adam and Eve than is recorded in Genesis, because you remember that Abel knew enough to bring the blood sacrifice. And you remember the Apostle Paul says, by faith, Abel brought a better sacrifice than Cain. You can't have faith in something you've never heard about. So the details obviously were given. But how to keep them alive? Now we do know that the Adamic peoples living among the other non-Adamic races, discussing these things, some of the things they knew got out among the pagans and appeared in garbled and caricatured form in the pagan religions. Now all the pagan religions of the world are alike. They say that man must make sacrifices to appease an angry God. We have, of course, most details from the Greeks probably, but according to the general pagan theory as well set out by the Greeks, if you became a little bit too prosperous, the gods became envious that you had all this. So you had to offer sacrifices that cost so much, they really hurt you financially. And so the gods would decide that, well, if you'd been punished this much for it, why, maybe you could get off without anything more. The Christian religion alone has the opposite. It has God making the sacrifice to save man. Now, nobody took the old pagan idea and refined it into what is Christianity. It's obvious that the higher idea, in the hands of people of no spirituality, was garbled and distorted into the lower form. Ancient tradition says that Enoch and Seth were the ones who worked out the signs of the zodiac. And it may well be because, as I say, among all the pagan peoples of Western Europe and Asia and North Africa, the signs were the same. And it goes back fully that early. Now, only one of these constellations resembles at all the thing it was named after. Scorpio, you can very clearly trace the figure of the great scorpion, his two pincers out there and the tail curved over his back ready to sting. But as to the others, one and all, the wildest nightmares of a drunken maniac couldn't figure out any resemblance from the star pattern to the thing they named it after. If you look at any zodiac, the figures drawn against a pattern of the stars making up the constellation so named. And where the stars are situated on this figure is as random an assortment as if they were fired into it with a shotgun, a poorly choked shotgun. It's a scattered pattern bearing no resemblance at all. So, what caused them then, all these people, to recognize these things under the same titles? The ancients, of course, believed that the appearance was real, that the earth sat still in the center and the stars and the sun went around it. Now, you can tell, of course, at night looking up, you can see when the moon is against the background of a particular constellation, and they say the moon is in that particular constellation or sign. Now, the only way you can tell which one the sun is in is by figuring out the entire circle around the sky and knowing what one is out there where the sun is, because obviously in daytime you can't see anything out there but the sun. The first record that we have, recorded form, of the signs of the zodiac was called the Illumination of Bel. You remember that Bel was one of the Babylonian names for the god who was the deification of Satan. This was compiled by order of Sargon of Agade about 3800 BC. Now, the Babylonians were not only astrologers, but they were also great astronomers. You remember, they lived in a desert country, no smog, no coastal fog. On those nights, the stars looked as though you could reach up and grab one. And they studied them diligently, and their larger temples that were in the form of a high tower had an observatory on the top. Now, the story of the Tower of Babel is garbled, maybe worse than most of the things, in your King James Version. In your King James Version, they say, "Let us build a tower whose top shall reach unto the stars." If you check it in the Hebrew, they say, "Let us build a tower with the stars on the top." In other words, in the glazed tile pattern with which this thing was covered, they would have the signs of the zodiac set on the top of it. And that was commonly done. We find in Egypt some ruined temples, such as those at Esna and at Dendera, where on the ceiling of the temple, the signs of the zodiac were painted in a circle. But Babylonian records show that they kept a careful record not only of eclipses, they had a record of the wanderings of the planets. The early name for planets meant the wanderers. They didn't stay in one place like the other stars. And they would be able to tell you when the star Jupiter was in a particular constellation. That is, you saw it against the background of that constellation. They left records also not only of comets, but apparently they watched the sun through smoked glass because they left records commenting on the presence of sunspots. So while they didn't have telescopes, as far as we know, the old boys were doing a good job of astronomical observation. Very likely, they did the same thing as the Egyptian priests. Now, to be able to fix the calendar accurately is very important for an agricultural civilization. If you plant your crops a little too early because you got a spell of warm weather, you wind up losing it because they're frostbitten. And if you wait till a little too late, you don't get much of a crop by the time harvest is there. So to be able to keep track of the calendar was important. Now, as you know, due to the tilt of the Earth's axis, the sun apparently rises high overhead in midday in summer, not as high in winter. It rises over the eastern horizon pretty well to the north of east in summer, pretty well to the south of east in winter, and the same corresponding changes in sunset. So we know that in some of these Egyptian temples, they were laid out so that there was a little window or porthole in the wall, so located that when the sun reached the farthest south point in winter, when it rose at that point, the light of the sun would shine through this little hole and fall on a certain marker on an altar way back to the other side of the temple, which told them that from that time on, the sun was going to start rising farther and farther to the north. In other words, you had passed midwinter, December 21st, 22nd, and were going on into the new year. So the priests kept track of the calendar, and because they were the only ones who knew how to do it, it gave them much more importance and influence. And probably the same thing is true of these Babylonian temples, that they were used in that way. We do know, as far as painting the signs of the zodiac or setting them in mosaic tile designs on the ceilings, that this was done in Babylonian, Egyptian, and Persian temples, because we have found enough ruins of it to show it. Now, they divided the complete circle around the sky, following the path of the sun, into 12 roughly equal segments, approximately 30 degrees each. And in each of these 30-degree segments, there was one large constellation which gave its name to it, and scattered around other minor constellations. The word zodiac is derived from a primitive root. In Sanskrit, it means the way. Probably came down through the Hebrew sodi. In other words, the way followed by the sun, moon, and planets as they passed in front of the background of the fixed stars. Neither the sun, moon, nor any of the planets go more than 8 degrees south or 8 degrees north of the center line of this, the plane of the ecliptic. Now, the principal constellations or signs of the zodiac are Virgo, the Virgin, Libra, the Scales, Scorpio, the Scorpion, Sagittarius, the Archer, Capricornus, the Goat, Aquarius, the Water Bearer, Pisces, the Fishes, Aries, the Ram, Taurus, the Bull, Gemini, the Twins, Cancer, the Crab, and Leo, the Lion. Well, in later pagan times, they botched the thing up, perhaps intentionally, and began with Aries, the ram, as the first of these signs, ending with Pisces, the fish. Now, suppose you scrambled the order of things in your Bible. You began in Genesis with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and you finally wound up with his crucifixion as the last part of the book of Revelation. You wouldn't get too much out of the story in that order, would you? It would look as though the thing was a final failure. So where you begin on this thing is important. And one mythical ancient animal was the clue to it, the Sphinx. You've heard of the riddle of the Sphinx, and there was a riddle of the Sphinx, and it's not the one you've heard about. The story was, you know, that this mythical animal stopped travelers in the desert and propounded a riddle. If they could answer it, they'd be allowed to go on. If they couldn't, why, the Sphinx would kill and eat them. It had the body of a lion and the head of a woman. Now, the real riddle of the Sphinx was, where do you start on this circle? Which is the first of the signs of the zodiac? Now, in the Egyptian temple at Dendera, the zodiac on the ceiling has a Sphinx painted between the sign of Leo and the sign of Virgo. Now, Sphinx is from the Greek word sphingo, meaning to join, to bind together. Well, where you join the beginning and the end to make a complete circle, that was the riddle of the Sphinx. And they showed the head of a woman. So you began with Virgo. You proceeded to the body of the lion, and Leo was the last sign in the circle. That, we'll see what this sets out. The fact that the truths of the Bible were set up there in a brief and general form so that people, as long as they watched the stars, would be reminded of these things. That is indicated in the Bible in Psalm 19, verses 1 to 6. It's a bit clearer in Smith and Goodspeed because, as always, your King James Version botches it up to say in some places the opposite of what it means. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the sky shows forth the work of his hands. Day unto day pours forth speech, and night unto night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet their voice goes forth through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. In them he has pitched a tent for the sun, who is like a bridegroom coming forth from his chamber, and rejoices like a strong man to run the course. From one end of the heavens is his starting point, and his circuit is to the other end, and nothing is hid from his heat. Well, all down through this period, they might forget some of the things that their grandfather told them, that his grandfather had told him, and so on, if they didn't have something like that to remind them of it. You people, how much do you remember of the stories your grandfather used to tell you about the things when he was a child and where the family came from and all that kind of thing? You probably paid no attention. And so with these important things. Well, we know that you must start with the sign Virgo. In all these ancient zodiacs, it's always the same. They show the figure of a woman with a branch in her right hand and a stalk of wheat with the ear, the head of grain, on the stalk of wheat in her left hand. Now, the Egyptians said that this represented the goddess Isis, but they gave her the name Aspolia, the seed. Now, what's the significance of this, the seed and the branch of the woman? Well, of course, Genesis 3:15 said that the seed of the woman was going to crush Satan's head. But what about the branch? Well, there's several places in the Bible, obviously prophetic of Christ, which calls him the branch. For example, Isaiah 4, verse 2, "In that day shall the branch of Yahweh be beautiful and glorious." Isaiah 11, verse 1, "And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots." Now that's unquestionably prophetic of Christ. Jeremiah 23, verses 5 and 6, "Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will raise unto David a righteous branch, and a king shall reign and prosper, and shall execute judgment and justice in the earth. In his days Judah shall be saved, and Israel shall dwell safely. And this is his name whereby he shall be called, Yahweh our righteousness." Now, the brighter stars have been named, and even today astronomers use the ancient names, some of them Hebrew, perhaps more of them Arabic, for at least 150 of the brightest stars. And their names are quite significant. One of the stars in this constellation Virgo is called in Arabic Al-Zimah, the branch. Later, the Romans gave it the Latin name Spica, an ear of grain. Another star in this constellation Virgo, Zavijava, meaning gloriously beautiful. Remember Isaiah, "In that day shall the branch of Yahweh be beautiful and glorious." Still another star, El-Muredim, "who shall have dominion." Now, whoever named the constellations and the stars knew the Bible story. Near the constellation Virgo is a smaller one, Coma. In Hebrew, it means the desired. The ancient zodiac showed this as a woman carrying a child in her arms. The ancient Egyptian name for this constellation was Shesnu, the desired son. Well, Haggai 2, verse 7, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith Yahweh of hosts. So, as your starting point, you've got Genesis 3, verse 15, that from the seed of the woman shall come the promised Redeemer, who shall rule and have dominion after destroying Satan. Now let's go on to the next one of the signs of the zodiac, Libra, the scales. The Hebrew name was Mozanaim, meaning weighing. The Arabic name, Al-Zubina, the purchase or the redemption. Now, I've talked to you before about the matter of redemption in Bible law. If poverty came upon you and you were forced to sell the family homestead or to mortgage it and lost it by foreclosure, you, if you got the money, could redeem it, or if you didn't have it, your next of kin could redeem it for you. He redeemed it by buying it back from the one to whom you had lost it. And inasmuch as you could not part with the family rights to the homestead longer than until the next Jubilee year, if at the time you sold your property there were 20 years left until Jubilee, why, the purchaser got the right to keep the property for 20 years. After 5 years, your relative decided he'd redeem it for you. So there remained now 15 years of the 20 unexpired. So he would pay 3/4 of the original price and buy it back, redeem it for you. Now it's significant here. You have the scales, but with the Arabic name, purchase or redemption. You simply cannot make out in the star pattern anything resembling the scales. You know how the ancient scale was. You had a horizontal beam suspended from the middle, and at each end you had 3 cords going down holding a shallow, flat pan in which the things to be weighed were placed. Well, this is drawn as a scale set down flat on the ground. In other words, the beam is lying on the ground. Nearby are these 2 pans and the cords tangled around. You can find 3 stars that would fit in the circle of the rim of one of the pans. Other than that, you can't find anything that remotely suggests the way they show the sign of the zodiac. It doesn't look like scales any more than Virgo looks like the figure of a woman. There are 3 very bright stars in this constellation Libra. The brightest is named Zubin al-Janubi, the price which is deficient. In other words, the price that any man can pay, his own death, is not enough for his own redemption. The next brightest star, Zubin al-Kamali, the price which covers. Now, you look up in your Old Testament where forgiveness of sins is discussed. The Bible's idea of pardon for your sin is not merely that God remembers what you did, but just withholds the punishment. The Bible idea is that it is covered up or blotted out. It is no longer seen. And therefore, when it's talking about forgiveness of your sins and that sort of thing, the Hebrew word used means to cover. The price which covers, that's the price paid by Jesus Christ on the cross. And the third brightest star, Zuben al-Akrab, the price of the conflict. The conflict between Jesus Christ and Satan and the frightful price that he paid in that conflict. Incidentally, among the old Akkadians, the name for the month corresponds to the small constellation, the crown. Ophiuchus has seized him with both hands and is pulling him away from that. So your symbolism there is not something they got out of paganism, I can assure you. The brightest star in the constellation Ophiuchus is in his head. And in Arabic it's named Ras al-Hagus, the head of him who holds. And he holds the serpent, holds him back from victory. Other stars in Ophiuchus are named Triophus, meaning treading underfoot, and Saif, bruised, Megaros, meaning contending, and Carnibus, the wounding. This is a battle to the death. The constellation Serpens, the serpent that he's grasping, is, as I say, one of these ancient ones shown on these old zodiacs. Again, in the same general portion of the sky is the constellation Hercules. This was so named, of course, by the Greeks. This is shown as a mighty man, bending on his right knee, his right heel lifted up again as if wounded. Now his left foot is directly over the head of the constellation Draco, the dragon. In his right hand he's grasping an upraised club ready to strike with it. And in his left hand he is strangling a triple-headed monster. So it's battle, all right. In the zodiac at the temple at Dendera in Egypt, it shows him as a human figure with this upraised club. His name in Egyptian is Bau, meaning he who is coming. They knew he wasn't here yet. The brightest star, which is in his head, is Ras al-Gethi, the head of him who bruises. Now, as I say, the Greeks perverted everything they touched. It's unfortunate, all we know about some of these ancient peoples is what Greek travelers wrote about them after they came back. But it seemed to be an essential part of the Greek character or the Greek civilization that you must always garble things up badly. You find, of course, much Greek writing about the Egyptians, and you cannot find one Egyptian pharaoh, including the one who was on the throne when this Greek writer was traveling in Egypt. You cannot find the name of one Egyptian pharaoh that you can recognize at all. Now, if he tells what he did, that in his day he had a war with such and such a country, you can find out from the Egyptian histories what pharaoh it was. But the names bear no resemblance at all. And they did, in their paganism, garble things up pretty badly. As I say, changing this to their mythical hero, Hercules. Now, the wiser Greeks knew the utter perversion of their paganism. Aristotle, for example, in his book Metaphysics, says about the Greek mythology that religion and philosophy had been lost. He said much had been added after the mythical style, and some little had come down and may have been preserved to our times as the remains of ancient wisdom. Polybius says that in his day, religion, such as it was recognized as a necessary means to political ends. Neander says that their religion was the fragments of a tradition which transmitted the knowledge of divine things possessed in the earliest times. But he recognized they had only fragments of it by his own time. Well, here you have these figures trampling on the serpent, the scorpion, the dragon. All right. Take Psalm 91, verse 13. Thou shalt tread upon the lion and the adder, the young lion and the dragon shalt thou trample underfoot. Now the next sign in order was Sagittarius, the archer. This was always shown as a centaur, a mythical figure with the body of a horse and the trunk, arms, and head of a man. And this centaur, holding an arrow, bow and arrow, the bow drawn, ready to let fire, and his arrow is aimed directly at the heart of Scorpio. Now, why the mythical figure of the centaur, if it's setting out Bible truths? Well, the centaur had two definite natures, a higher and a lower, didn't he? He was part man, he was part animal. It was to suggest that the creature that this was representative of also had two natures, Jesus Christ, God, and also man. That was very probably the reason for this. Anyway, they all agreed upon the figure. They all agreed upon the name. Hebrew and Aramaic name, Kesef, the archer. Greek, Toxotes, the archer. Latin, Sagittarius, the archer. Now, in Egyptian and in Coptic, they gave him the name Pin Ma'eri, the beauty of the coming forth. And in the ancient Akkadian, the name was Nunki, meaning Prince of the Earth. Well, here is this figure with his higher and his lower nature, ready to fire an arrow into the heart of the scorpion. Let's try Psalm 64, verses 7 to 9. God shall shoot at them with an arrow. Suddenly shall they be wounded. So shall they make their own tongue to fall upon themselves. All that see them shall flee away, and all men shall fear, and shall declare the work of God, for they shall wisely consider of his doings. Now, Jesus Christ was the one who destroyed the power of Satan, the one who had the double nature of God and man, was the one who was victorious. And while, of course, he will ultimately use the entire power of God the Father to shoot these arrows, don't forget that it was the one with the dual nature who accomplished the triumph. Close to Sagittarius is the constellation Draco, the dragon, shown with his head right beneath the foot of Hercules. Now, from the Orient, that is China and Japan, we've gotten the idea of the dragon as a sort of superheated alligator. But among the peoples of Western Asia and the Mediterranean, it was a serpent, not the Chinese or Japanese style dragon. In the zodiac of Dendera, this constellation Draco is showing us a serpent beneath the front hooves of Sagittarius, this centaur. His front hooves are just about to come down on and smash this serpent. And the Egyptian name, Herfent, the serpent accursed, was given to him. The brightest star in the head of Draco, Thuban, the subtle. 47 centuries ago, that was the pole star. The next brightest star in the head is Rastaban, head of the subtle one. Arabic, it's called Al-Wa'id, who is to be destroyed. And the third brightest star in the constellation is named Ethanim, the long serpent. The next, number 5 in the list, Capricornus, the goat, is a strange one indeed, because in all the ancient zodiacs, it's a compound animal, something like the centaur. From the waist forward, it has the forequarters and head of a goat, and the rear half of it is a fish's body and tail. You didn't raise any of those when you were on the farm, did you? Now, it's always shown with the goat just collapsing in death. The front legs are buckled under it, the head is drooping, it's just collapsing in the moment of death. But the rear half, this fish's tail, is squirming with vigorous life. Now, what's all this about? Well, you don't get any solution out of paganism. But go back to the Bible and see what happened with regard to a goat. You remember I've told you about the Day of Atonement. Well, some of you may not have heard it. The symbolism of the animal sacrifices in the Bible was very clearly this. At any time during the year, any Israelite who realized he had committed a sin could go to the temple and offer the animal sacrifice. Not that the Bible said there was any particular merit in cutting the throat of a sheep or a goat, but that you were acting out this statement. I recognize that the penalty of my sin is death, and it has to be my own death unless someone dies in my place. I am offering the death of this animal not as the real sacrifice, but as a symbol that the time is coming when the Redeemer is going to die in my place. That was the meaning of the animal sacrifices. Now, having done this, he went away cleansed of his sin. He'd left his sin behind him at the temple. It still had to be accounted for, even though not by him. So, all during the year, all the sins of all the people were accumulating at the temple until you came to the Day of Atonement. Now, as is set out in some detail in the book of Hebrews, the high priest was symbolic of Jesus Christ. The high priest was dressed normally in very gorgeous robes, the finest of linen, beautifully embroidered in colors and in gold thread. He had on his head not a mitre. That's some more of the perversions in your King James Version. You've seen a Catholic bishop's mitre, the tall cap cut on top so it looks like the gaping jaws of a fish's head. It was intended to. They got it from the priests of Dagon in Babylon. Dagon was the fish god, D-A-G-O-N, spelled in your Bible, and you probably call it Dagon, but that's what it is. What he wore was a turban, not a mitre, on the front of which was a polished gold plate engraved holiness unto Yahweh. Then he had on his breast, the breastplate, an embroidered pouch of linen, and attached to that another plate of polished gold set with 12 gemstones, each stone being engraved with the name of one of the tribes of Israel. What are you going to do if you want to try to make a person symbolize the majesty of God? It's an impossible thing, but about the best you can do is to give him some very ornate uniform, at least, to set him apart, isn't it? So that's what they did. And the high priest ordinarily wore this uniform, which was symbolic of the full majesty of God. But on the Day of Atonement, there was a very special ceremony. Now, he was only a man. He had his own sins, which barred him from acting out the part of Jesus Christ until he first offered a sacrifice for his own sins, so that cleansed of those, he was now permitted to go on and act out the part. He offered then a sacrifice to cleanse the temple of the sins of the people which had accumulated throughout the year. Now, as you know, the layout from the tabernacle in the wilderness right down through Solomon's temple and all was 3 parts. There was an outer court into which the people could come, bringing their sacrifices, which they handed over to the priests. There was an inner court containing the altar, where the priest burned the sacrifices on the altar, and there was an innermost, holy of holies, into which no one could go, not one of the priests, except the high priest only, and he could enter it only on the one day of the year, the Day of Atonement. Now, in this Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the chest in which the stone tablet with the 10 Commandments written thereon by the finger of God, and Aaron's rod that budded to show that God had chosen him to be the high priest, and a golden jar full of a sample of the manna. These were contained in this chest. It was about 4 feet long, about 2.5 feet wide, and 18 or 20 inches high. Set down flat on the ground, it would make a seat that one could sit on. And it was called the mercy seat. God said, I will be sitting there in the Holy of Holies. Now, on each end of it, there was a large carved and gilt statue of an angel with outstretched wings. They were so placed that the angel at the left end, his right wing extended out over the Ark of the Covenant to the center point, and the angel at the other end, his extended wing came out to meet this one, so they formed a canopy over the mercy seat. Well, this, of course, represented heaven, where God in all his majesty maintains his headquarters. Now, the high priest, having cleansed himself of his own sins and cleansed the temple, 2 goats were brought to him, chosen on behalf of the entire nation. And by casting lots, 1 goat was selected to be offered as a sacrifice for the people. The other goat, your King James Version, with its customary distortion and mistranslation, says 1 goat for a scapegoat, and there's nothing like it in the original Hebrew at all. It says 1 goat for Azazel. Now, Satan is not a name of any person at all. It's a title. It means the opponent, the adversary. Manager is not a name. Even if you're speaking of manager of some particular company, it doesn't tell you who is the manager. And Satan doesn't tell you who is the opponent. The other title used in the Bible, Lucifer, the shining one, again is not a name but only a title, and it doesn't tell you who he is. And you've got to look in the book of Enoch to find the answer to that, because the Bible itself does not explain about Azazel, although it does mention him, one goat for Azazel. In the book of Enoch, it tells how the rebel angels coming to earth had decided to intermarry with human women, and that their descendants were giants, and that these angels, rebel angels, were teaching men all kinds of sins. Now, it gives the names of 20 or 30 of the principal ringleaders, and one of these is Azazel. So God sends a committee of 4 of the great archangels down there to investigate and report back. That's very similar to what you have in God's investigation about Sodom and Gomorrah before destroying them. So they come back and they say, yes, it is every bit as bad as it was reported. So God tells one of them, I forget which one now, Raphael or Uriel, he says, you to Azazel ascribe all sin. There wouldn't have been any sin committed by men if he had not taught them so. To Azazel ascribe all sin. Now you go down there and tie him up and cast him into a pit out in the desert, and we'll leave him there till I get around to his final judgment. Now note the symbolism of the Day of Atonement. These are goats now, not sheep. One goat is chosen as a sacrifice for the people, and one goat for Azazel. Now the high priest takes off these magnificent robes of office, bathes, dresses in plain white linen, symbolic of sinless purity, and comes back to perform the ceremony of the Day of Atonement. Jesus Christ laying aside the full majesty of the Godhead to come in the form of a man, but a man with no sins of his own. Now, the goat on behalf of the people is sacrificed, and the high priest takes some of the blood of the sacrificed goat, and he goes in through the veil into the Holy of Holies and sprinkles a little of this blood of the goat in front of and on the mercy seat, reminding God all these sins that earned the penalty of death have been paid for. Here is the shed blood to show they've been paid for. They're entitled to thy pardon. Then he comes out of the Holy of Holies. He puts on again his majestic robes. You remember in the book of Hebrews, it tells us how Jesus Christ is our real high priest, and he is in the heavens until the time of the restitution of all things, when he will come back. So, symbolic of the return of Jesus Christ, not the second time in the form of a man to be pushed around and murdered, but coming back with all the majesty and power of God. And he takes the remaining goat for Azazel, and this one is not sacrificed. He lays his hands on the head of this goat and confesses over him all the sins of all the people. And then this goat is dragged out of the city to the edge of the desert and given a good sound kick and sent on out into the desert. He's going back to Azazel with the message, "Hear, Azazel, all these sins are yours. For you there's no sacrifice. You answer for these." So, by the goat, the one sacrificed, that goat died, but the people received life by it. And of course, that goat sacrifice in behalf of the people was again symbolic of Jesus Christ by his death, paying the death penalty for us. Now get back to our figure of Capricornus, the dying goat. But the other half of him, this fish, squirming with vigorous life. Now you probably know that the cross was not used as a symbol of Christianity for the first 2 centuries AD. Up until that time, they used the fish. You remember Jesus Christ had told a couple of his disciples, "I will make you fishers of men." And since fish multiply tremendously, forming great schools or shoals of fish, the fish was symbolic of the way Christianity would multiply into great numbers of people of that faith. So, the fish part was living with vigorous life because the goat part died. One of the stars in Capricornus bore the Arabic name Deneb al-Gedi, the sacrifice comes. Incidentally, at the time of the crucifixion of Christ, at that time of year, the sun was in this sign Capricornus and very close to this star, Deneb al-Gedi. So whoever placed the constellation there and knew the significance of it knew also prophetically the time of year when it would be. You remember it was at Passover, so Moses told them what time of year it would be, what day of their month it would be. So all this was known from early times. But now there isn't any part of this that evolved out of paganism. There isn't any part of this that can be shown to illustrate or support paganism. The pagan peoples knew that that's what these constellations were supposed to represent, and they even had names for the stars showing the significance. But they were merely repeating what had been taught centuries before, and without themselves realizing fully the significance of it. Well, let's take one more and then we'll call it enough for this evening. The next one in line is Aquarius, the water bearer. That's the modern Latin name. It was always shown as the figure of a man holding in his right arm a large urn, the mouth tipped somewhat downward, and a great stream of water pouring out of it. And the stream of water pours down into the open mouth of the fish, slightly below his feet. The fish drinks up all this water pouring out of the open mouth of this urn. That fish was called Piscis australis, the southern fish, to distinguish it from the other constellation of Pisces, the 2 fishes. Now this Aquarius and the fish, that was very ancient. The early Egyptian zodiacs show it, and the Arabic peoples had it too. Now, the pouring out of the water, of course, very ancient. Isaiah 44, verses 3 and 4. For I will pour water upon him that is thirsty, and floods upon the dry ground. I will pour my spirit upon thy seed, and my blessing upon thine offspring. And they shall spring up as among the grass, as willows by the watercourses. Psalm 65, verse 9. Thou visitest the earth and waterest it. Thou greatly enrichest it with the river of God, which was full of water. And you remember John 4, verse 14, Jesus Christ said, Whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. So you have the figure of the man, symbolic of Christ, pouring out this water of life, and the fish, remember, the symbol of the Christians, receiving and drinking up all this water of life. So, the one thing that will make sense out of these constellations is the Bible. As against the background of any of the known paganisms, they're meaningless. As compared to the Bible, they make good sense. They illustrate exactly what the Bible is talking about. Starting with the branch, the seed of the woman, he does receive the wound in his heel from Scorpio, but he crushes the head of the serpent. With his hands, he drags it away before it can seize the crown. Everything here meeting the Bible. Incidentally, that wound in the heel, the way these things pass into pagan mythology appears clearly here. You remember among the ancient Greeks, they had the myth of, who was it now that was killed by a wound in his heel? Achilles. The story among the Greeks was that the mother of Achilles had been warned that he was likely to be killed when he grew up. So she took him to the river Styx, the river that flows between the land of the dead and the living, and she dipped him in the waters of the Styx, which was supposed to give him an armor plate skin that weapons wouldn't pierce. But she had to hold him by something or other. She held him by the heel as she dipped him in, and the heel didn't get dipped. That was the one place that was vulnerable to a wound. And so he was killed by a wound in that heel. Now you find another memory of the same thing showing up in the Germanic myths. You remember the hero Siegfried. Siegfried killed the dragon, and a regular river of blood was pouring out of the cut throat of the dragon. So Siegfried stepped under it to take a shower bath in the blood of the dragon to get this same armor-plating effect, which was to make him invulnerable to wounds. But a leaf from a linden tree overhead broke loose and flip-flopped down and landed on his back between his shoulder blades, and that made one spot that the dragon's blood didn't reach. And so the villain Hagen attacked him from behind, hurled a spear into that one vulnerable spot in his back, and killed him. Now the source of those things, you can see where it comes that Christ was to have the vulnerable heel. That is, in the act of crushing the head of the serpent, nevertheless, there he received his own wound.
Pastor Comparet will conclude this subject on the next cassette. This tape was produced by Your Heritage and Pastor Bertrand Comparet. We have much more information in written form and tape recordings, both reel and cassette. We offer this material to assist the personal ministries of those who are called to awaken Yahweh's Israel sheep to the truth of His Word and the necessity for national repentance. Feel free to call upon us for personal consultation. We welcome your suggestions as to how Your Heritage can more effectively spread the gospel of the kingdom. Many people are meeting in their homes using Pastor Comparet's material as a basis for their study. Such groups represent a healthy return to the early assemblies of believers and offers those who finally see the light and come out of the Babylonian church system a place to worship with other believers. We would hope that such meetings would also provide the nucleus of support for our radio broadcast in your area, and we shall be happy to cooperate with you in this regard. As you know, Your Heritage is not associated with any organization. As our congregation, we depend upon your tithes and offerings to pay the expenses of spreading the gospel. We try to merit your support. Please send your letters, your requests for material, and your generous contributions to Your Heritage, P.O. Box 5486, San Diego, California, zip 92105. Goodbye, and may the grace of Jesus Christ be with you all.
Pastor Bertrand Comparet.
We had been starting to talk about the gospel and the stars, the signs of the zodiac, not as the pagans tried to mix them up and not as the astrologers give their foolish stories about them, but to show that from the beginning, even among the pagans, they recognized these constellations in the sky as having a significance which actually makes no sense under any of the pagan religions, but is a setting forth in the sky of the things that are the essentials of the Christian religion. Now, I think the most foolish nonsense ever spoken is the idea that any of these constellations or planets influence your character or abilities according to what one was rising at the hour of your birth. I give no credence to it at all, and that is not the idea I'm talking about. What I have in mind is this, that from the earliest times, among these pagan peoples even, they all had a uniform system for this. They divided the circle of sky around the earth along roughly the path taken by the sun and the moon as they go around the earth. They divided it into 12 major divisions, each of which was named after a principal constellation within that segment of the sky. And also in each of these sectors there were several minor constellations. And practically all the ancient civilizations agreed upon the names which they gave to these constellations. Now, with the one exception of Scorpio, which does look like what it's named after, the rest of the constellations bear not the faintest resemblance to the thing they were named after. As I said, the wildest nightmares of a drunken maniac couldn't figure out from the pattern of the stars anything resembling the things that they were called as constellations of the zodiac. And yet, with nothing to suggest from the way the stars are placed that this is what it should be, here, even these pagan ancient empires all had substantially the same names for these constellations. Now, what it comes down to is this. It's quite obvious that in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, God gave more information to Adam and Eve than is recorded in just Genesis 3, verse 15, where, of course, the first promise of the coming Redeemer, Jesus Christ, is found, where God said, to Satan, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. And the same Hebrew word zerah for seed or descendants was used in both cases. So Satan was to have just as literal seed as was Eve. And he goes on, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. Thou shalt bruise his heel, and he shall bruise, or some translations say crush, thy head. Now you find a long gap from there on before you get any more prophecy. You run into a couple of thousand years. Now what was to keep all this alive? We know, of course, that God told Eve that this promised descendant of hers who would crush or bruise Satan's head would be God himself coming as one of her descendants. Because, and here again it's concealed in the mistranslation of your King James Version, you read that Eve bore Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. But in the Hebrew she says, I have gotten a man, even Yahweh. In other words, like all of us, wishing for the accomplishment of all this sooner than it came, she thought, well, one of my descendants is to be God himself in human form, so here's my descendant, this is the one. Well, we know, of course, that wasn't the case with Cain. But she couldn't have made that kind of a blunder if she hadn't been told that the one of her seed who was going to crush the head of Satan would be God himself. Again, of course, we know that the significance of the blood sacrifice was explained because Abel brought the blood sacrifice, which was accepted, and Cain didn't, and his was rejected. And we're told in the book of Hebrews that by faith Abel brought a more perfect sacrifice than Cain. Now, you can't have faith in something you've never heard. Well, obviously, to keep all this from being lost in the centuries when prophecy was not available, someone, and the ancient traditions say that it was Seth and Enoch, someone figured out a way to call these various constellations after things which would remind you of what was to be more fully explained eventually in the Bible. Now, the last time we looked through these constellations, we saw that to make any sense out of it, you've got to begin with Virgo, the woman. Then you go on through the next one, Libra, the scales, Scorpio, Sagittarius, the centaur archer, Capricornus, the goat, and Aquarius, the water bearer, pouring out the water of life. Now let's go on to the seventh of these signs of the zodiac, Pisces, the fishes. Now, despite the fact that the stars don't themselves outline any such pattern, you find in many ancient temples, upon a wall or upon a ceiling, they have drawn out the whole zodiac with the figures outlined there. Now, the fishes, it shows two large fishes at practically right angles to each other. And there is a broad ribbon or band, one end tied around the tail of each of these two fishes, and quite a long slack in this band. And the middle of it, where it's doubled, is shown fastened to the neck of a sea monster. Now, of these two fishes, with the band fastened to their tail, One of them is trying to swim north toward the pole star. He's looking up. The other one at right angles along the plane of the ecliptic. You remember that among our people always there have been some who were looking up to God for guidance and for the permanent life that's to come. Others who are materialists and quite content with the present situation as long as they can get along in some fashion in it. And so they're shown here. In the zodiac on the ceiling of the Egyptian temple at Dendera, this sign has marked beside it the Egyptian name Pikot Orion, the fishes of him who is coming. Now, why fish? Well, not merely because they were an important item of food, but of all useful creatures anyway, fish multiply faster than any others. It only takes a little while for a few fish to become a great shoal or school of fish. And you remember one thing always promised to our people was that the nation of Israel should become very numerous. And fishes were a symbol of rapid multiplication. It's worth noting, incidentally, that a fish was also the first symbol adopted by the early Christians. The cross was not used for a couple of hundred years afterward, but they adopted a fish. As remember that Christ said to one of his disciples, "I will make you fishers of men." Now the rapid multiplication, Jeremiah 30 verse 19, "I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will also glorify them, and they shall not be small." Ezekiel 36 verses 10 and 11, "I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, even all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited, and the waste shall be builded. And I will multiply upon you man and beast, and they shall increase and bring fruit." Now this band or ribbon with which these fish were tied was always recognized among the ancients as a separate constellation in itself from the two fish. The Egyptian name for it, Uor, he cometh. The Arabic name, Al-Risha, the band. Now, as I say, the middle of this band is shown fastened to the neck of Cetus, the sea monster, and immediately above is the constellation Andromeda, a woman captive in chains. Now, the Greeks elaborated considerably on that with their legend. There was this seaport city where fishing was a very important part of their way of making a living, and this sea monster came along and scared away all the fish, and the town was in a bad way. So they decided the only thing they could do was offer a human sacrifice to this sea monster. So they chose among their people this woman Andromeda, and they chained her to a rock out in the sea. And you remember that the hero Perseus came along and rescued Andromeda from that in the Greek legend. Well, you can trust the Greeks, of course, to get everything botched up and wrong that they touch upon. The Greeks had a sort of form of religion, but few of the Greeks, and nothing can be said for the morals of the ancient Greeks, but few of the Greeks were as bad as the gods they worshipped, so they didn't take their religion very seriously. And any poet who wanted to write an epic poem about the doing of their gods was free to do so. There was nothing sacred about it. After all, a bunch of thieves, murderers, drunkards, what have you, if those are all you've got for gods, it's hard to find anything sacred in it. So when it comes to these Greek legends, while you can wonder where the Greeks got the germ of the idea and trace it back somewhere, don't expect to find any truth expressed in any of the Greek legends. Now, the significance, of course, of this, you remember the Bible often speaks of Israel as a personified as a woman, the daughter of Zion. Well, Israel was taken into captivity more than once, you remember, and held captive until delivered by the Redeemer. The Hebrew name of this constellation Andromeda is Sirah, the chained. The brightest star in Andromeda is called Al-Firatz, the broken down. The next brightest, Mirah, meaning the weak, and the third, Adil, the afflicted. Well, now that's a situation in which the nation of Israel was left on more than one occasion, you remember. And God got her out of it from time to time. But listen now to the Bible references to this, which show what this was intended to mean. Isaiah 54, verses 11 to 13. O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest and not comforted, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors, and thy foundations with sapphires. I will make thy windows of agates, and thy gates of carbuncles, and all thy borders of pleasant stones. And all thy children shall be taught by Yahweh, and great shall be the peace of thy children. Again, Isaiah 52, verses 1 to 3. Awake, awake, put on thy strength, O Zion, put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Shake thyself from the dust. Arise and sit down, O Jerusalem. Loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For thus saith Yahweh, Ye have sold yourselves for naught, and ye shall be redeemed without money. Now, right near to the constellation Andromeda is another bearing the Greek name Cephus, the king. In the zodiac at the temple of Dendera in Egypt, it bears the name Pekuhor, meaning this one is coming to rule. Cephus, the Greek name, is really derived from the Hebrew scythe, which means branch. And you remember the several references to Jesus Christ as the branch. The brightest star in Cephus is Alderamin, meaning coming quickly. The next, Alfert, the Redeemer, and the third brightest, which is in the left knee of the figure, Al-Rai, who bruises or breaks. You remember, he shall bruise thy head. The eighth constellation in this series of 12 of the zodiac is Aries, the ram. The ancient Hebrews called it Tale, meaning the lamb. The Arabic name was Al-Hamal, the sheep. But if you go way back to the ancient Akkadians, their name, Bara Zigar. Now, bar meant altar or sacrifice, and Zigar, making right. So, Bara Zigar, the sacrifice of righteousness. And you remember that a sheep was offered as the sacrifice. It's worthy of note the names given to the two brightest stars. Now, these names are very ancient, and even today, about 150 of the brightest stars in the heavens are still known to astronomers by their ancient Hebrew or Arabic names. The brightest star in Aries, in the forehead of this figure, the ram, called El Nath, or some of the Arabic writers called it El Natik, the wounded or the slain one. The next brightest in the left horn, Al-Sheratan, the bruised. Now, at the time of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the day of the crucifixion, the 14th day of the Hebrew month Nisan, the sun was in this sign Aries and practically at the point occupied by these two brightest stars. How's that for calling your shots 4,000 years ahead of time? In this sector named after Aries the ram, nearby and somewhat above Aries is the constellation Cassiopeia. In all these ancient zodiacs, this is shown as a woman seated on a throne. Her right hand is drawing a scarf over her shoulder. Her left hand holds a branch, and with her left hand she's arranging her hair. She is very close beside Siphus, the king. Now the Arabic name of this constellation Cassiopeia, El Seder, the freed. A very ancient name was Daughter of Splendor. The Chaldee name, Dat al-Kursa, the enthroned. Now you remember that the nation of Israel is promised that she will be the bride of Christ, bride of the King. Now let's see what Isaiah says about this. Isaiah 62, verses 3 to 5. Thou shalt be a crown of beauty in the hand of Yahweh, and a royal diadem in the hand of thy God. Thou shalt no more be termed forsaken, neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate. But thou shalt be called Hephzibah, which means my delight is in her. And thy land shall be called Beulah, meaning married. For Yahweh delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married. For as a young man marrieth a virgin, so shall thy restorer marry thee. Your King James, mistranslated as always, says, so shall thy sons marry thee, which of course is an absurdity and contrary to Bible law. So shall thy restorer marry thee, and as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall thy God rejoice over thee. Now going on to constellation number 9, Taurus, the bull. With the exception of the Egyptians, all the ancients called this the bull. The Chaldee name, Tor. Arabic, Al-Thor. Greek, Tauros. Latin, Taurus, all meaning the bull. In the Dendera zodiac, the name written beside it is Apis, the head or chief. The Hebrew name, Shur, comes from a root with a double meaning, both coming and ruling. In all the zodiacs, Taurus is shown as a charging bull, head lowered and those great sharp horns thrust forward. The brightest star in Taurus is Aldebaran, meaning the leader or the governor. The next in the tip of the left horn, El Nath, slain. Within the huge outlines of Taurus, you find also the smaller constellation of the Pleiades, the constellation of the ruler or the judge. Now, I've told you about some of the remarkable things in the Great Pyramid. The fact that in the mathematics of its design you find astronomical mathematics that our greatest scientists didn't know enough about it to verify until within our own lifetime. So that obviously those were matters of inspiration at the time the pyramid was made. Well, now the names given to some of these stars also show inspiration. The brightest star in the Pleiades is called Alcyone, which means the center. Now, you've all seen pictures of spiral galaxies, those great clouds of scores or hundreds of millions of stars that so often are scattered in the form of a great pinwheel across the sky. And you know that our Earth is in a galaxy which appears to us in the sky as the Milky Way. That's one of these great pinwheels, and our solar system is located about 2/3 of the way from the center to the outer rim of it. The whole shape of it is more or less lens shape, that is thicker at the center and tapering off thin at the outer edges. It takes considerably over 200 million years for this galaxy to make one revolution. But as nearly as our astronomers can determine today, the center of gravity of the entire galaxy, which has, I forget how many hundreds of millions of stars in it, the center of gravity about which our entire galaxy rotates is about at the position of this star Alcyone in the Pleiades. You remember Job was asked, canst thou, what is it, break the bands of Orion or loose the sweet influence of the Pleiades? Well, it is a sweet influence, all right, because if you didn't have some center of gravity about which these stars could move, you'd find them scattering in all directions with a good many collisions. But now, back in those days, when there is not even a legend or a myth about anybody having a telescope, how did they find out about this? Well, we're still talking about this big constellation Taurus, the bull. Again, a symbol of the might of God's people Israel. They weren't the biggest nation. They were always running into others more numerous than themselves. But because God was the one who stood back of them and got them out of their difficulties, they had the power to smash many kingdoms. Deuteronomy 33, verse 17, speaking of the tribe of Ephraim, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of the wild ox. With them he shall push the peoples together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. Psalm 44, verse 5 adds a little more. Thou art my king, O God. Command deliverances for Jacob. Through thee will we push down our enemies. Through thy name will we tread them underfoot that rise up against us. In this same sector of the zodiac, and close to Taurus, is the constellation Orion. In the Dendera zodiac, the name given is Hagata, which in Egyptian means he who triumphs. And hieroglyphic characters written close to it read Or. Now, we use this Greek word Orion, the name the Greeks gave to this thing, but it was anciently written Orion. It's derived from a Hebrew root meaning light. The Akkadian name, Urana, the light of heaven. The Hebrew, however, called the entire constellation Kesil, the strong one, the hero. In all these zodiacs, Orion is shown as the figure of a mighty warrior. With his right hand, he's brandishing a club. With his outstretched left hand, he is grasping the head and skin of a slain lion. His left hand is planted firmly, his left foot, I should say, is planted firmly on the head of an enemy. And it's interesting to note, in his belt is a sword. And on the hilt of the sword, the pommel, the knob at the end of the hilt, is carved in the form of the head of a lamb. Now, you don't think of that as a warlike emblem, except you remember what the Lamb of God is able to accomplish. Well, the lion's skin and head, yeah, he was not only going to bruise Satan's head, he was going to skin him. In 1 Peter 5, verse 8, we're told, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about, seeking whom he may devour." The names of the stars in this constellation Orion are interesting again. The brightest star, which is in his right shoulder, Betelgeuse, the coming of the branch. Remember, all your references in the Bible to the branch are to Jesus Christ. The next brightest, in his left foot, which is over the head of his enemy, is the star Rigel, the foot that crushes. The third brightest, in his left shoulder, Bellatrix, swiftly destroying. The fourth brightest, Alnatic, the wounded one. And another down on the right leg, Saiph, bruised. Remember, his heel would be bruised in the process of crushing Satan's head. Now, this enemy he's conquering, that he's got his left foot firmly planted on, you find the Romans messed this up a bit. They called this constellation Lepus, the hare. But it wasn't that way in any of the ancient constellations. That's just a Latin corruption. In the early Persian zodiac, it was a serpent. In the zodiac of the Temple of Dendera at Egypt, it is shown as an unclean carrion bird standing on a serpent. And the name given in the Dendera zodiac, Bashti Beki. Bashti means confounded, confused. Beki, failing. The brightest star in this constellation are Nebo, the enemy of him who comes. The Arabic name for it, Arnebeth, is the same. Two other bright stars in it, Nibal, the mad or insane, and Sujia, the deceiver. Another constellation shown in all these ancient zodiacs is a river flowing out from the downcoming foot of Orion, where he's stepping on the head of the enemy serpent. Eridanus, the river of the judge. It's an immensely long constellation. The ancients always said this was a river of fire. Well, you have to go clear over to the book of Revelation, the latest book of the New Testament, to find this. Oh, no. There's reference to it there, but you will pick it up earlier in Daniel. Daniel 7, verses 9 to 10. I beheld until the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. The river of fire of the judge. Going on to the 10th constellation of the zodiac, Gemini, the twins, is the least clear as to its meaning. The Greeks claim to have invented this constellation of Gemini, the twins, and it is entirely possible that the more ancient form of it has been lost because, you can interpret it, but with less certainty. The Greeks called these twins Apollo and Hercules. The Latins called them Castor and Pollux. The Dendera zodiac named this sector of the zodiac Claustrum Hor, the place of him who comes. Now, in the Dendera zodiac, it shows two figures walking toward you. The second of the two figures, not sketched too clearly, but looks as though it might be a woman. The ancient Coptic name for this constellation, Pi Mahi, the united. The Hebrew name, Thamim, meaning united, and the Arabic name, Al-Talman, again meaning united. Now, the Dendera zodiac showed these two figures walking toward you, but most ancient drawings of the zodiac show two seated figures side by side. The one on the left has a club in his right hand, not brandishing it ready to strike, just merely holding it. A few of the old drawings show him with a palm branch rather than the club, but most of them show the club. A star in his left foot is called Al-Henna, the hurt or afflicted. Remember that wounded heel. The figure on the right carries a harp in his right hand and a bow and arrows in his left hand. And again, not with the bow out ready to shoot, he's just merely carrying it. In his knee is a star called Mebsuta, meaning treading underfoot. Now, both of these figures are simply resting. They're neither in action nor preparing for action. You might say resting after victory. Significance, we can't with too great certainty say. It could be a reference to Jesus Christ's two natures. Man who fought evil but was wounded, and God who conquered. You remember you find in the centaur, again a pretty obvious reference to the two natures. As the centaur was part man, part beast, so Jesus Christ was part God, part man. In this same segment with Gemini are two constellations, Canis Major and Canis Minor, the great dog and the lesser dog. In Canis Major, the star at the tip of his nose is Sirius, meaning the prince. The Akkadian name for it was Kasista, leader of the heavenly host. Other stars in it, Wesson, the shining, Adhara, the glorious, Askeri, meaning who shall come, and the Arabic name Al-Shira Al-Jaminia, the prince of the right hand. Now, Canis Minor, in the Dendera zodiac, it bears the name Sibak, meaning conquering. The Dendera zodiac does not show it as a dog. It shows it as a human figure with a hawk's head and a hawk's tail. Remember, one of their Egyptian gods was so shown. The brightest star in Canis Minor is Procyon, meaning Redeemer. Other bright stars in it, Al-Shira, Al-Shemelia, the prince of the left hand, Al-Mirzam, the ruler, and Al-Gomera, he who perfects. Compare any of these with any of the ancient pagan religions, and we have a pretty good idea of all of them. And any of these constellations make no sense at all. They have no significance. Compare these with the Christian religion, and you can see where all of these fit in. Now remember, these were people living in a desert land, no smog, no fog. Clear, bright nights when all these stars were brilliant. They would be looking at the stars, and the idea was that all down through these centuries, looking at the stars, they'd recognize these constellations and have a reminder of the thing that was eventually going to be explained in greater detail in the Bible. The 11th of the constellations is Cancer, the crab. Now, in the zodiac Dendera, it's shown as a scarab, the sacred beetle of the Egyptians. To the Egyptians, the scarab was a symbol of resurrection and immortality. Originally, it was just a grub worm. And then it went into this pupa, resting stage, apparently dead. And then out of it hatched this winged beetle that could fly off into the air. So they said that this was a symbol that out of death comes resurrection and renewed life. So, not a crab, but the scarab was shown there. The same is true of the zodiac in the Egyptian temple at Esne, and it's also found in a Hindu zodiac of about 400 BC. Now, it's true that later Egyptian zodiacs used the crab. In the Dendera zodiac, however, they gave it a name, Claria, meaning cattle folds, a corral into which cattle are driven for safekeeping at night. The Arabic name for this constellation was Al-Sartan, he who holds. Now, there is no word for crab in Hebrew. Crabs were unclean things that they didn't even dignify with a name. In the Aramaic, which is closely related to Hebrew, the name given to this constellation was Sartano, meaning who holds. The Greek karkinos, holding or encircling. Now, of course, all these would be true of the cattle or sheep fold where the animals are penned up for safekeeping at night. The brightest star in it, Tegmine, meaning holding. Another, Akubeni, meaning sheltering or hiding place. Both Hebrew and Aramaic, the same on that. Another, Arabic, Ma'alef, meaning assembled thousands. And another Arabic name, another star in it, Al-Himarain, the kids or lambs. So you have then the fold where the sheep are assembled for safekeeping. Now close to this are two minor constellations, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the Great Bear and the Lesser Bear, and again, a totally botched up name. No bear is shown in any Chaldean or Egyptian or Persian or Hindu zodiac. It was the Greeks who botched this one up. The way they show it, Ursa Major. Now you know what a little tail a bear has. Ursa Major has a tail fully as long as a wolf's tail, and Ursa Minor has a tail about twice as long as a wolf's tail. So that's no bear. Incidentally, the present North Star is in the tip of Ursa Minor's tail. Now, how did they botch up this name for bear? Well, in Hebrew, the word dover means a fold for animals, sheepfold, cattle fold. The Hebrew dove means rest or security. And there's neither rest nor security when you're around bears, I can assure you. Well, where did they get it? There's a Hebrew word of somewhat similar sound, but of different spelling, dove, meaning a bear. So, the Greeks were so contemptuous of all other people. All of humanity was divided into two groups, Greeks and all others who were barbarians. It didn't matter if you had twice the culture that he had, you were still a barbarian if you weren't a Greek. And therefore, they were too contemptuous of other people ever to bother getting any of their language straight. You note that all the Greek travelers and historians writing about Egypt always mangle the names of the Egyptian pharaohs till it's impossible to recognize them, except where these Greek writers tell about some incidents in that pharaoh's reign, which you can identify from the Egyptian records. A particular pharaoh did that particular thing. So they weren't going to bother trying to figure out what was right. They heard the Hebrew name dove, a bear, and dove. Well, same thing. We'll call it a bear. The brightest star in Ursa Major has the name Dube, meaning a herd or a flock. In Ursa Minor, the brightest star is this tip of the tail, the North Pole star. And in Arabic, it was called Al-Rukaba, the one on which things turn or revolve. Now, at the time these zodiac signs were named, that was not the pole star. Alpha Draconis, the brightest star in the constellation Draco, the dragon, a good many degrees away from our present pole star, was then the North Star. And how did they figure out that at the time we would be studying this thing, this one was going to be our North Star, the one that is turned on? Well, when the dragon was cast down, where do you find the center of things? In the lesser sheepfold. Remember that the ancient name for these were the sheepfolds. Why the smaller of the two, the lesser instead of the larger one? Where have you found the elect? In the majority or in the minority? So, it is picked with perfect consistency, the lesser sheepfold. The elect who have all the time desired a better country. Two bright stars found in this, in addition to Al-Rukaba, are Kokab, meaning awaiting him who is coming, and Al-Qaid, the assembled ones. Well, as to Ursa Major, the great bear, the Arabs called it Al-Naish, the assembled. The brightest star in it, Dube, meaning herd or flock in Arabic. The next brightest, Merak, a Hebrew word meaning the flock. Another is named, and this looks like a Greek name, Theta, meaning visited or guarded. Another bright star, Megres, meaning separated. And finally, in Arabic, El-Kathra, meaning covered. Now here you have a bit of symbolism which wouldn't have meant anything outside of the Bible. Ordinarily, you think of the meaning of forgiveness as meaning that whatever penalty there would have been will not be inflicted. But the Bible's idea of divine forgiveness goes much farther than that. In one place, you remember one of the Psalms. It says, "As far as the east is from the west, so far hath he removed our sins from us." And in many places, the Bible quotes God as saying that I will not remember your sins. They will be covered up as with a cloud. Now, the whole idea of forgiveness in the Bible is that your sins are just covered up and blotted out. They're not there to be seen anymore. It's not merely suspension of the punishment, but it's that they are no longer to be seen. So, this star meaning covered makes sense with our religion. You can't fit it anywhere into the pagan religions of any of these ancient peoples who named these constellations, and some of them named the stars. Well, God speaks, you know, of us as his sheep, and he will gather us safely into a fold. For example, Ezekiel 34, verses 12 to 17. "As a shepherd seeks out his flock in the day that he is among his sheep that are scattered, so will I seek out my sheep, and I will deliver them out of all places where they have been scattered in the cloudy and dark day. And I will bring them out from the people, and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them to their own land, and feed them upon the mountains of Israel by the rivers, and in all the inhabited places of the country. I will feed them in a good pasture, and upon the high mountains of Israel shall their fold be." All right, finally getting around to the 12th sign, completing the circle, Leo, the lion. This sign is found in all the most ancient zodiacs. The Egyptian, including the temples at Dendera and Esna, the Mithraic zodiacs in Persia, the Hindu zodiacs. Now the Dendera zodiac shows this lion treading on a serpent, treading him down with his front feet. The Egyptian name given to the constellation, Pe Mentikion, the pouring out. The zodiac at Dendera shows the lion treading down a serpent and a bird of prey perched on the serpent, ready to start eating the carcass, and standing by is a woman holding 2 cups. Beneath this sign is written Knem, meaning he who conquers. Now the Hebrew name for this constellation Leo is particularly significant. There are 6 different Hebrew words meaning lion, but they have differing significance. And Arya means a lion hunting down his prey. Not just merely a lion, but a hunting lion. The brightest star in this constellation, Leo, Regulus, meaning treading underfoot. The second brightest, Denebola, the judge who comes. Third, Al-Geba, the exaltation. Fourth, Minkir al-Asad, the tearing by the lion. Another, Al-Dafera, the enemy put down. Another, Deneb Alased, the judge who seizes. Another, Sarkam, a Hebrew word meaning the joining. Now you remember I told you that the temple at Dendera showed the clue to where you have the beginning and ending points on this circle. That was the riddle of the Sphinx. And that name Sphinx comes from the Greek word sphingo, to join. And where do you join the two ends to form the circle? And they put the figure of the Sphinx between Virgo and Leo. The Sphinx had the head of a woman, so you began with the constellation Virgo, and the body of a lion, so you finished with the constellation Leo. That was the riddle of the Sphinx. Well, you know who the lion is. Revelation 5, verse 5. And one of the elders said unto me, Weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. And God speaks sometimes of his pouncing upon his enemies like a lion. Isaiah 42, verses 13 to 20. And it's interesting to note that while he is threatening disaster to his enemies, at the same time he is expressing his care for his own people. Yahweh shall go forth as a mighty man. He shall stir up jealousy like a man of war. He shall cry, yea, roar. He shall prevail against his enemies. I have long time holden my peace. I have been still and refrained myself. Now I will cry out like a travailing woman. I will both destroy and devour at once. I will waste mountains and hills and dry up all their herds. I will make the rivers islands, and I will dry up the pools. And I will bring the blind by a way that they knew not. I will lead them in paths that they have not known. I will make darkness light before them, and crooked things straight. These things will I do unto them, and not forsake them. Hear, ye deaf, and look, ye blind, that ye may see. Who is blind but my servant, or deaf as my messenger that I sent? Who is blind as he that is perfect, and blind as Yahweh's servant? Seeing many things, but thou observest not. Opening the ears, but he heareth not. Well, beneath the front feet of Leo, the lion, is the constellation Hydra, the serpent. That's an immense constellation extending over 100 degrees in the sky. The very name Hydra of it means he is abhorred. Resting on the back of this serpent is the constellation Crater, the cup. You remember the Egyptians had some hint of that, even garbled up. They had this woman holding 2 cups. But here is shown a huge cup resting on the back of the serpent that is being trodden down by the lion. What's the meaning of it? The cup of the wrath of God. Revelation 14, verses 9 to 10, and 16, verse 19. If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Then, perched on the back of Hydra, the serpent, Corvus, the raven. You remember a raven or a crow is a carrion bird, eating the carcasses of dead things. And it's shown perched on the back of Hydra, tearing at his flesh. In the Dendera zodiac, The name written there is Herna. Her meaning the enemy, na, breaking up or failing. Now let's briefly go back over this. The first sign of the 12, Virgo, the woman, with a branch in one hand and a few stalks of wheat with the seed grains in the head in the other. Remember, the seed of the woman was to be the Redeemer, also identified as the branch. Libra, the scales. You remember from time immemorial, the scales have been the symbol of justice and judgment, weighing. And you remember that the two most brilliant stars in this constellation, one had a name meaning the price which is deficient, the price of death which a man could pay was still deficient, and the other star, the price which covers, the death of Christ that paid for our sins. The third constellation, Scorpio. The scorpion trying to sting the heel of the figure of Ophiuchus, shown as a mighty man who is treading on the scorpion and holding in both his hands a serpent. The serpent's open jaws are reaching up toward a smaller constellation, the crown, and Ophiuchus is dragging the serpent away so he can't seize the crown, and at the same time treading down the scorpion, although he's being stung in the heel while he's doing it. In this same sector of the zodiac is also the constellation Hercules, a mighty warrior, one foot evidently wounded, but the other foot set on the head of Draco, the dragon. The fourth sector, Sagittarius, the centaur. As I say, illustrative of the two natures of Jesus Christ, and he is shown with a bow in his hand and arrow drawn back to full length, ready to let fly, and the arrow is aimed right at the heart of Scorpio. The fifth, Capricornus, the goat. And you remember that this was the most peculiar goat that anybody ever saw. The front half of it was a goat, all right, and the rear half had the body and tail of a fish. Now, the goat half was shown collapsing in death, the legs buckled under it and the head drooping. But the rear half, this body and tail of the fish, was wriggling with all sorts of life. So, you remember now that on the Day of Atonement, the sacrifice for all the people was a goat. And by the death of the goat, life was given to them. And remember, the fish, as I say, became the early emblem of the Christians. Aquarius, the figure of a man holding this great jug or urn, tipped so that out of the mouth of it is pouring a great stream of water, the water of life, which Christ said he would give to all of us. Then we go on with the seventh, Pisces, the fish, and so on, that we have taken in detail tonight. Now take any or all of these signs of the zodiac, try to make sense out of them in the light of any pagan religion you can think of, and it won't work. The pagans had them, they didn't understand them. You see, our early ancestors, the next few generations after Adam, were living among the pagan pre-Adamite peoples, And they naturally talked about their religion, and these things got out. For example, our religion is absolutely unique. It has the sacrifice being made by God in order to save man. Now that didn't make sense to these pagans, so they twisted it around, and in all pagan religions you will find that whenever man gets to be prosperous or has a bit of good luck, the gods become jealous of him, and so man has to make a sacrifice expensive enough that it really hurts in order to placate the angry and jealous gods. Now, we didn't get our idea of sacrifice from them, that's a cinch. They got theirs from us and couldn't understand it and garbled it up. Similarly, they were told what these constellations were, and they kept the idea. Some people carried the idea as far as India, where you had these zodiacs among the Hindus, and of course all through the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, Egypt, Greece, Rome. Oh, they tried to weave some legends around them, but it didn't make much sense. They didn't understand it. They did remember the name and the figure, although, as I say, with the one exception of Scorpio, it doesn't make sense at all. You cannot get any indication of the figure out of the pattern of the stars. So obviously they were told it from a source which had figured this out, not because the stars looked like these things, but because he wanted to put a series of 12 great figures to remind you of 12 important factors that would be explained in more detail eventually in the Bible. Now, of course, among the pagans, botching it up and debasing it, they developed the legends about how the different stars and planets and so on influenced your character, and according to which one was just rising over the eastern horizon, you might be intelligent or you might be stupid. You might be good-natured or you might be irritable, or whatever it might be. Silly rot, of course. But go back to where they got this from, and you'll find it makes sense by one standard only, and that is the standard of the Bible.
A little more than 1900 years ago, the best and kindest person who ever walked this earth in human form spent 3 years intensively doing nothing but good. On many occasions, he displayed the power of God to work miracles. In an age when superstition was strong, and most people expected a display of miracles to convince them of great power, there would naturally be a great temptation to impress the multitude by a show of supernatural power. The Jews were constantly demanding that Jesus Christ should work some miracle as a sign that he was more than just a man. All 4 Gospels record this. Matthew 12, verses 38 to 40. Mark 18, verses 11 and 12. Luke 11, verses 16 and 29 to 32. And John 6, verse 30. But he always refused to do this. Just as he refused to perform miracles for Satan, as is recorded in the 4th chapter of Matthew, he also refused to perform them at the demand of the Jews. First of all, he did only those miracles which the prophets of the Old Testament had prophesied that the Messiah would do. This was for a definite purpose. Those who knew and believed the Old Testament, which was all of the Bible that was in existence at that time, would by this recognize him as the Messiah, the Christ. When John the Baptist sent some of his disciples to inquire if Jesus really was the Christ, as we read in Luke 7, verses 19 to 22, Jesus reminded them of the particular miracles which he had performed, these being the very miracles which Isaiah had prophesied. This would be proof enough for John. But those who could not or would not see this also could not understand his true character when he told them that he was the Christ, as he told the Jews in John 10, verses 24 and 25. What was the nature of these miracles? They were all connected with the great gospel he preached, that of the kingdom of God. In the kingdom of God, the defects of the present age will not exist, and Jesus had come to set men free from the crushing burdens which we carry in this evil age. The great majority of his miracles were the healing of the sick, the deformed, the paralyzed, and the blind, and he also freed them from possession by demons. The Jews well knew that leprosy was incurable, so far as all human skill of that day could do, yet on several occasions Jesus Christ healed it with only a spoken word. Those who otherwise were condemned to the living death of a disease under which their flesh rotted away while yet they lived, and because of this they were outcasts from all human society. These people he restored to full health and useful, happy life. Twice he restored strength and activity to those who for years had lain hopelessly paralyzed. One woman who had for 18 years of misery been deformed as a hunchback, he restored to perfect form with only the touch of his hand. Many who lived in the hopeless despair of blindness, he blessed with renewed vision, giving them not only the beauty of the world about them, but also the usefulness which enabled them now to earn their living instead of being dependent upon charity. Those who lay in pain and weakness upon their beds, too sick to rise, more of these than could be counted, he healed with only a spoken word. Many who were dumb came to him for help, and to them he gave the power to speak. God did not intend that we should be tormented by sicknesses which also shorten our lives. He meant for us to live under the glorious conditions of his kingdom, free from crime and sin, free from sickness and death. But instead of this, men have always chosen to live under the rule of Satan, despite the terrible price we have paid for this all during the course of human history. It was to set us free from this that Jesus Christ came. As he said in John 10, verse 10, "I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly." Therefore, these miracles of healing were a demonstration to us of the perfection of his kingdom, as well as the proof of his identity. Again, he fed multitudes, 4,000 at one time and 5,000 at another, out in the desert where no food was to be found. For this purpose he made a few fishes and loaves of bread, sufficient to feed thousands, and even the scraps left over were more than the food they had in the beginning. But note that he did this, not for the benefit of the merely lazy. He did it for those who had followed him to listen to his teachings, and who would not leave him even to go back to the towns where they could eat. Only when there was a hunger of the soul for his truth did he also feed their bodies. He calmed the storm at sea to save the lives of his disciples who were threatened by it. He cast out devils from those whose lives had been ruined by them. Here was the power of God plainly displayed, and yet the unbelieving Jews only scoffed and said that he could only cast out devils by the help of Beelzebub, the prince of devils. But the Jews well knew that by the laws of God in the Old Testament, to which they gave insincere lip service, their priests should have been able to cast out devils, yet they could not. So Jesus reminded them in Matthew 12, verses 22 to 28, "If I by Beelzebub cast out devils, by whom do your children cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges. But if I cast out devils by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God is come unto you." Finally, as the greatest miracle of all, he several times restored the dead to life. Surely here was the power of God beyond any possibility of doubt. But also, here was the demonstration of the goodness of God, who doesn't want us to suffer death and to set us free from it through Jesus Christ. In the kingdom of God, the reign of death is ended. In all of these, we see his consistent policy. When Satan asked him to turn stones into bread, and to show that he could safely jump from the topmost pinnacles of the temple as demonstrations of his supreme power over nature, he refused. Yet he produced food in plenty to feed those who believed in him, and he calmed the storm to save the lives of his disciples. In a world where God's economic laws were mocked at the cost of ever-widening poverty among the people, where the moral laws of God were mocked at the cost of general depravity, where the sick became more numerous with each generation, and they had lost the power to restore to sanity the wretched ones who raved and fought. In that world, with only a word or the gentlest touch of his hand, he stopped pain and sorrow, he restored the sick to strength and usefulness, and he reminded them that only God is the source of all good. As he said in John 5, verse 19, "Verily, verily I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For what things soever he does, these also does the Son likewise." These miracles were not to display his power for the admiration of the fickle mob. They were to show the power of God and what it would be like in the kingdom of God, for which the faithful few waited. How glaring was the contrast between the world as he found it and the kingdom of God which he taught them. But let us not forget that our world of today is very little better than that which rejected him 19 centuries ago. We also have our sick, our cripples, our paralyzed, many of whom we know not how to heal. We also have our poor, but we have not learned how to feed them, except at the cost of such excessive taxes that they again create the very evil they were supposed to remedy. We also have our storms and natural calamities bringing death and destruction, but we are powerless before them. And we also face the bitter sorrow of families separated by death. All our vaunted civilization, our education, our science has not relieved us of these evils. How long will it take us to see that man's materialism, however good his intentions, can never furnish the answer to our needs? It is just as true today as it was then, that in Jesus Christ alone is the answer. His power, his mercy, his goodness and generosity afford the only possible way for us to secure the good things which can come only in the kingdom of God.
This tape was produced by Your Heritage and Pastor Bertrand Comparet. We have much more information in written form and tape recordings, both reel and cassette. We offer this material to assist the personal ministries of those who are called to awaken Yahweh's Israel sheep to the truth of his word and the necessity for national repentance. Feel free to call upon us for personal consultation. We welcome your suggestions as to how Your Heritage can more effectively spread the gospel of the kingdom. Many people are meeting in their homes using Pastor Comparet's material as a basis for their study. Such groups represent a healthy return to the early assemblies of believers and offers those who finally see the light and come out of the Babylonian church system a place to worship with other believers. We would hope that such meetings would also provide the nucleus of support for a radio broadcast in your area, and we shall be happy to cooperate with you in this regard. As you know, Your Heritage is not associated with any organization. As our congregation, we depend upon your tithes and offerings to pay the expenses of spreading the gospel.
Please send all correspondence to our new private zip code, Your Heritage, San Diego, California, 92116-0100. And now goodbye, and may God richly bless you.